The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 8, The Trip, Segment 1, Planning the Trip.
Welcome to Chapter 8, The Trip. This is Segment 1, Planning the Trip. Most people think that the trip to Texas was some type of impromptu decision made by Kennedy. John F. Kennedy's trip to Texas was not an impromptu adventure. Rather, there had been discussions and suggestions about the trip going all the way back to late 1962. In late 1962, Lyndon Johnson made a suggestion that Kennedy to come to Texas and visit various cities and visit the citizens of that state. That first request by Johnson in '62 fell on deaf ears from the Kennedy camp because Johnson probably was already written off as Kennedy's vice presidential running mate for '64. After that request, which was ignored by Kennedy, Johnson made a second request closely after his trip to Miami in February of 1963, where the group on his plane met with mobsters prior to Johnson and that group going to the Dominican Republic. Now, here's the problem. The Warren Commission and other sophits have always claimed that the JFK luncheon site and motorcade route in Dallas wasn't known until just days before the event. And it wasn't decided upon until just 7 days before the event. So everything just had to be random. That is a falsehood. The truth is, the Dallas luncheon site and the motorcade route were matters that were fought about between Kennedy staffers who knew about the event coming up and the Texas planners, Johnson and Conley, and they fought about it for more than 50 days before the event. Ultimately, the Texas planners won the fight, got their luncheon site and motorcade route that killed Kennedy. The question, of course, is why were the Texas planners so adamant about these items? It has perplexed John F. Kennedy's advance man, the person in charge of making sure that his travels were smooth and secure. That man was Jerry Bruno, and it bothered Jerry Bruno up until his death. Here are the full facts. The traditional Dallas motorcade route from 1936 on went straight down Main Street and did not go on Houston or Elm, and it did not do any 90-degree or greater turns because that violated Secret Service protocol. Also, 3 sites for the JFK luncheon were discussed. One was Market Hall, that was unavailable. One was the Woman's Building, which was easy for the security for Kennedy to secure and would have avoided a motorcade route going on to Elm and Houston Street. And the third site, the site that the Texas planners won, was the Trade Mart, which created security problems in itself since it had an open courtyard, making any protection of the president very difficult since people could look down into the courtyard area from multiple floors above. John Conley was the person who said the Dallas Host Committee wanted their luncheon at the Trade Mart, and they wanted the route that Kennedy traveled upon to his death. This was advanced as early as late September of 1963. On October 3rd, 1963, John F. Kennedy's White House staffers were already urging him not to travel to Texas because the LBJ scandals were starting to explode and get worse, and they did not want him to be seen associating with Lyndon Baines Johnson during such a crisis period. However, the very next day, October 4th, 1963, John Conley got on a plane in Dallas, Texas, and flew 3 hours to Washington, D.C., went to the White House, and personally urged JFK to make the trip to Texas. During that discussion, Kennedy ultimately agreed. But after that, he told his secretary that it was very strange that John Connally was so adamant about him making the trip to Texas, rather than return back to Dallas. After his meeting with Kennedy, John Connally had an evening dinner with the other Texas planner, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he clearly advised him that JFK had agreed to go just as the Bobby Baker scandal was erupting. And for the rest of that month, as more and more information was coming out about Baker, and as Fred Korth resigned as the Secretary of the Navy in the TFX scandal, right in that month, Kennedy's staff kept telling him no. And in fact, for the remainder of that month, the trip to Texas was off, on, and on again. Finally, with it going back on, the matter was then sent to Kennedy's advance man, Jerry Bruno, to look at the trip from a logistics standpoint and a safety standpoint for the president. And when Bruno looked at the trip, especially the Dallas, Texas motorcade and luncheon site, he nixed it. He said, no, this creates unreasonable risk and a target for the president at both the luncheon site and on the motorcade route. Even though Bruno rejected the trip, the Texas planners persisted with their luncheon site and route. So, in late October, Jerry Bruno flew to Dallas, Texas to meet with Governor John Connally. When Bruno went there, he went to see Connally, and his staffers wouldn't allow him to see Connally, telling Bruno that he was too busy and that he should meet with the staffers. Finally, Connally agreed to meet with Bruno, and he was still insistent upon the location of the luncheon site at the Trade Mart and the motorcade route that Kennedy took. He kept telling Bruno that that is what the hosting committee in Dallas, Texas wanted. Bruno couldn't understand this because, generally speaking, most host committees in a city when a president's coming in will bend over backwards to appease the president and his staff, especially when it relates to safety. Things got so heated between Bruno and Connally that what Connally did was he got up and went over to a phone and dialed it, and with Bruno only hearing Connally's side of the conversation, Connally came back and told Bruno that he had just called the White House and they approved everything that he wanted and that Bruno had better stay out of it. So beginning the next month, in early October, Bruno contacted the Secret Service because he figured if he could get the Secret Service to veto the luncheon site and the route, things would be ended. Unfortunately, Bruno was told that the Secret Service had approved everything. Tragically, the day before, November 4th, 1963, the Secret Service really hadn't approved everything. They had only been advised on that day of the trip and nothing more. A few days later, October 8th, 1963, Governor John Connally reported to the Dallas newspapers that John F. Kennedy was coming to Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963, with stops in San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and Austin. On that same day, the Secret Service was for the first time told about the motorcade, but were not given any specifics. The Secret Service did not know about the motorcade route until November 15th, 1963, 7 days before Kennedy's killing in the motorcade. And on that day, November 15th, the Secret Service went to Dallas and for the first time drove the route. And although they didn't like it, they were told that that's what the host committee wanted, and that's what the White House approved. And they were told that the Dallas Police Department was going to provide security. Tragically, they were never told that the Dallas Police Department was ending its security at the intersection of Houston and Maine, and they were not supplying rooftop security to watch for shooters from any windows. After all was said and done, Jerry Bruno, John F. Kennedy's #1 advance man, blamed himself for Kennedy's death. He also found out after the fact that the Dallas Host Committee did not give one iota, did not care one bit about where the luncheon site was going to be or the motorcade route. He also learned that during his argument with John Connally over what the host committee wanted and the claim by John Connally that the White House approved everything he was saying was absolutely a lie. He learned that the person that John Connally was talking to was one of Kennedy's top aides, Kenny O'Donnell. And O'Donnell told him no. Although John F. Kennedy's staff did not want him to make the trip to Texas, and Senator Ralph Yarborough warned Kennedy's staff to watch Johnson and Connally because they might go after Kennedy politically to embarrass him if they don't watch him closely. And although Kennedy's personal advance man, Jerry Bruno, advised against going on the trip, did not want Kennedy to attend a luncheon at the Dallas Trade Mart, and did not want the motorcade route suggested by the hosts of the portion of the Dallas trip, Kennedy went. Despite all of those warnings, just like Julius Caesar did in Rome 2,000 years before, he ignored all of the naysayers and went on his way. So when Kennedy left the White House to start the trip on November 21st, 1963, the die had been cast. See you in the next segment.